Good afternoon and welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival and Foraging Fortnight online. The festival is now entering its 30th anniversary year and we're marking the occasion with our first online festival. Foraging Fortnight is a celebration of Scotland's natural environment and wild food. It's supported by Leader and Scottish Natural Heritage. We're delighted to be able to deliver the full festival programme to you wherever you are. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce two speakers, Len Wilson and Dennis Davidson. Both born and brought up in Stromness, they will be presenting their talk, The Boats for the Bay. Firstly, we have Len, a former radio officer in the Merchant Navy. Built boats at Mackay's Boatyard in the 1960s in Stromness for several years before turning to aviation. Still, in radios, he worked for the Civil Aviation Authority. And on Len's retirement, he built a yawl. And indeed, I met Len several years ago in Corpac when he was sailing up the Caledonian Canal in a yawl with my father-in-law. Since then, Len has built several yawls, flatties, furniture, and fiddles. Growing up in Stromness, Len had an awareness of the links of the Hudson Bay Company and has more recently attended the Rupert Island Colloquium in Edmonton and in Whitehorse, Canada, to speak of fiddle music connections. Now our second speaker, Dennis, is a practicing naval architect, now living in Helensburgh and works with boats up to 20 metres in length. In his spare time, he loves to research the traditional boats of Orkney. Dennis joined McGruers Limited in 1970 as a designer and technical director, specialising in cold moulded racing yachts and traditional sailing and motor yachts. He now works for Murray Cormack Associates and designs pilot boats, specialised harbour crafts, including small ferries. Dennis also has a great awareness of the Hudson Bay Company and strong Orkney connections. I'm very much looking forward to this talk, and if you have any questions for either speaker, please enter them into the YouTube live chat and we'll come back to them at the end of the talk. Now over to you, Len and Dennis.
Well, we're here to tell you a little bit today about the boats used in the fur trade. But first, I'd like to set the background, tell you a little of the history of how it all came to pass. Hudson's Bay Company celebrates its 350th anniversary this year. So it no longer operates in the fur trade, obviously, but it has a network of retail stores across Canada and America. The Birch Bark canoe and the yacht boat were both vital to the fur trade, but we'll look a little bit at the history. To start the beginning, we need to look at men's hats. For in Britain and Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, a man's hat was his badge of office. And there were penalties for any man that wore a hat above his station in life. Needless to say, the common working man did not feature in the privileged groups. The hats were made from felt, and the best felt was made from the soft underfur of the beaver. The European beaver was becoming increasingly scarce, so a group of wealthy noblemen set up the Company of Adventurers in London. It was to become the Hudson's Bay Company. The two men that sowed the seeds, ironically, were two Frenchmen. They were free traders who had travelled northwards up towards Hudson Bay hunting. And when they came back to France to try and raise money, they were kind of unsuccessful. The two men, Médard Chouard de Groseilliers and Pierre Esprit Radisson, were quickly nicknamed Gooseberries and Radishes. They got a meeting with Charles II and his German cousin, Prince Rupert. As a result of that, the company was set up. Charles II granted the company a royal charter with land rights to the sources of all the water courses flowing into Hudson's Bay. As Prince Rupert was a major player, the land became known as Rupert's Land, and gooseberries and radishes found themselves sidelined. At the time, nobody had any concept of the geographical extent of the territory. We now know that it covers most of the land mass of Canada. European wars made the English Channel a dangerous place, so the ships sailed in convoy with naval protection to Stromness to replenish for the transatlantic voyage. And the main destination was York Factory on the southwest coast of Hudson Bay. When they started to recruit Orkneymen in the early 18th century, they found that they were ideally equipped to withstand the arduous conditions of the wilderness, and they were willing to accept lower wages. Soon, Orkneymen would account for 80% of their employees. Many were carpenters and boat builders, and you'll hear more of that later. The American historian Bernard DeVoto said of the Orcadians, they pulled the wilderness round them like a cloak and wore its beauty like a crest. Some HBC posts were built on islands and isolated sites, so small boats were needed to communicate. Early boat types used included whale boats, longboats, and four-oar yawls. And in 1717, men were sent to cut wood for framing for a small fishing yawl, which was being built at Albany Fort. At the time, the company acquired a vast and varied fleet, ranging from canoes, yacht boats, paddle steamers for the inland waterways, and various types of coastal craft. And during World War I, they had a transatlantic fleet of more than 250 cargo ships carrying supplies to France. That's kind of by the way. There were two major players in the Canadian fur trade, Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. The Northwest Company was a group of free traders based in Montreal, and it was not permitted to trade in the HBC territory, so they traveled around the southern edge. As you can see on the map here, the Hudson's Bay territory covered this area and into Labrador. But the Northwest Company had to operate along the southern side of it and up towards Fort Chipewyan, Lake Athabasca. Inevitably, there was conflict between the companies, which led to war and murder on occasion. And this was resolved in 1821. The Northwest traders, it was resolved when the companies merged in 1821. And the Northwest traders soon discovered, of course, that the merger was really a takeover. But to keep them happy, they were given kind of major tasks and posts throughout the country. And they were also shareholders. There was another smaller outfit in the game, and there was a German immigrant, John Jacob Astor, famous name. He established his family's fortune in the American fur trade. And facing difficulties crossing the continent, he founded the port of Astoria on the Pacific coast, and they operated out of there. It was a difficult, lawless part of the country, and the company was taken over by the Northwest Company in a dodgy deal. And subsequently, of course, it became part of the Bay when they merged. It was a troublesome post with a lot of fighting and squabbling, so the Bay withdrew and moved north as the Americans were pushing their border further north to the 49th parallel. Now, Canada is covered by a maze of waterways. You see the rivers on the map here, but indeed there's far more than that. It's a wilderness of lakes all over the place. So boats, the logical way to get around. In the fur trade, the two major boats were the York boat and the Birch Bark Canoe. And the York boat really was the major player, the workhorse of the trade. But the canoe was also vitally important. It was fast on the water. Oh, yeah, and I should say, one historian said, no Birch Bark Canoe, no Canada. And I think that was very true. It was fast on the water and light enough to portage easily. And the native people of Canada had been building them for 3,000 years. So they have a long, long history. And in the fur trade, there were two main types of canoe, the Montreal Canoe or the Canoe du Maitre, and the North Canoe, or Canoe du Nord. The bay had a monopoly in Hudson Bay hinterland, so the Northwest Company were forced to travel, if you can see on the map there, from Lachine, which is just beside Montreal. They were forced to travel along the southern part of the territory and a long trip up to the west. That was a long distance to travel, so they depended upon the canoe. The Montreal Canoe was 35, up to 35 feet long by 5 feet wide, with a carrying capacity of between 2 and 3 tons. So a brigade of canoes was set out from Lachine. These were the Montreal canoes, the big ones, and they'd travel to Grand Portage on Lake Superior, west side of Lake Superior, and there they transferred to the North Canoes for the more arduous journey further north. Here we see a Birch Bark canoe. This is the Montreal Canoe. You see the size of it. And this one here shows a brigade on Lake Superior in the fog. It wasn't always like that because it could be a stormy journey as well. So they had a long journey, up to about 3,000 miles. They couldn't do it both ways in 1 year, so they'd travel out 1 year, over winter, and travel back the next. Whereas the York boats just had a short journey. They could go out and back in the 1 year because they went not to Montreal, but to the bay. None of this could have been done without the voyageurs and I'm trying to think what they called them now. They was the kind of the middlemen, engagés, to give them their French name. They paddled the canoes and carried huge loads over the sometimes lengthy portages. They were mainly young, macho French Canadians and Métis who took a pride in being able to travel at speed against all kinds of adversity. In the words of Canadian historian Peter Newman, they were in fact galley slaves, and the only reward was a defiant pride in their own courage and endurance. This is a Nars Canoe. You can see a much smaller canoe, depiction of it shooting the rapids. And I should have showed you that earlier. That's why we're back onto the map, but I'll move on. Here we see a very stately, important looking native in his Birch Bark canoe, rather more salubrious than the ones he used in the trade, I think. This is a North Canoe, the smaller one, and you see they used it when they were camping overnight as well. Just turn it up as a shelter. And here we have a Montreal Canoe, fully loaded up, and two rather important looking passengers there in the middle. The company, oh my God, a little bit ahead of myself, I'll leave it there. The company merger spelled the end for the Montreal Canoe because now all the trade went by York boats to York factory down in the Hudson Bay. And they had extended, by this time they had extended their territory right up to the Mackenzie and to the Arctic Ocean. That was all done by York boats. The York boat could carry 3 times the load of a Montreal canoe, and it could do the return trip in 1 season. And needed less labour. The Birch Bark was still crucial though. The North Canoe still travelled all over the vast continent carrying urgent supplies, messages and people. And by express when speed was required. And here we see George Simpson in his express canoe. Now for much of the 19th century, another Highland man was the governor in Canada for the HBC. That was George Simpson. He has been described as a bastard by birth and by persuasion. He certainly was a hard taskmaster with an eye on profits for the company. To that end, he travelled all across Canada every summer to keep his postmasters on their toes. He did it, of course, by Birch Bark canoe. His crew of voyageurs were hard-driven, and he was known to rouse them in the middle of the night to make an early start. The illustration shows him in city dress, complete with top hat, and his crew dressed in red sashes and headbands. And you might think that's a fantasy, but no, it wasn't. As he approached an outpost, he was determined to make a grand entry. They draw into the bank, out of sight to wash and spruce up and dress for the occasion. Then they round the bend at high speed with a piper playing and a second canoe carrying a bugler. The postmaster probably felt a sense of relief, for he'd been in tenterhooks for a few weeks. Simpson took great pride in his ability to travel long distances at breakneck speed. The Birch Bark canoe made it all possible. In 1828, he made a 5,000-mile trip across Canada and back. It was the longest ever canoe trip to be made in one season. He didn't do the paddling. Now I'm going to show you how to build a canoe in about 5 minutes. Not that I've ever done it, but we'll see. This is from, another couple of shots of the North Canoe. And this is a small family canoe for a native canoe. Now we're on to the Birch Bark. The National Film Board of Canada made a film of this, and these stills are from that. So if anybody's interested, do an online search for Caesar's canoe. This starts with the felling of the birch tree. Then he takes a sharp knife and he cuts a straight line down the trunk and starts to peel it off carefully, not to split it, progressing more and more till he eventually gets it off. At this point, he just rolls it up like a carpet and brings it home to unroll it flat on the ground. This rack at the left-hand side is the template for his canoe. So it's set out with heavy stone set on top of it to keep it in place, and he starts to bend up the sides. There you see them bent up with stakes in place to hold them. The sides are not high enough yet, so we'll see what he does about that. Here they're adding more birch bark to the upper sides of the canoe, and they'll be stitched together. To do the stitching, he uses the pine roots, which he splits, coils into a coil, and boils in water to make it supple, and starts the stitching. Both holes to push the thongs through. And he has an assistant there sewing the top sides on, and they do a really neat job of stitching, as you'll see. Then to make the bow and the stern, he takes a bit of timber and splits it with a knife so that he can bend it to the shape. There you are, has the two ends laced and braced into place. Starting to cover them. You see a row of stitching along there. This excess will be cut off afterwards. Progressing, a gunwale fitted on the outside. He makes a series of ribs to fit inside by heating them in boiled water and bending them. Then it has to be lined with thin laths, and there he is. It's very straight timber, and he just starts a nick with a knife and splits it by hand, and then he'll continue splitting these planks until he gets them to the right number and the right thickness. There he is fitting them in. There they are fitted with the ribs on top, notched into the gunwale. He pours a waterproofing mixture of sap over the top. This is gum that comes from the trees, which have been prepared by boiling. And then he squeezes it into the seams and onto the stitching. And here you see almost complete, a bit of decoration on the outside. The completed canoe, looking very elegant. The one on the right, I think, is fiberglass. Here we have him going to tend his nets. And here we have the object of it all. For this man anyway, was for fishing. And I'm going to hand you over now to my friend Dennis, who will continue to tell you more about the York boat.
Much of the information I will present in this talk on York boats comes from the researches of Dennis Johnson in Canada, who wrote a book on the subject entitled York Boats of the Hudson Bay Company. He has extensively researched their history, usage, and design, and we have corresponded over many years. It was a Stromness man called Joseph Isbister who initiated the building of wooden boats instead of canoes to transport furs and other goods on the rivers in northern Canada for the Hudson Bay Company. He signed on for the Hudson Bay Company as a sailor in 1726, becoming master of the sloop Moose River II in 1738 and chief factor at Albany Fort in 1740. Next. As Len has described, beaver furs were initially transported downriver to the forts by Birch Bark canoe, and Isbister relied on skilled natives to build and paddle them, as Scots and English boatmen were, quote, entirely unhandy in canoes. Next. The North canoes were between 24 and 28 feet in length, paddled by 5 to 7 men, and could carry up to 1.2 tons of cargo. Next. In 1745, Isbister decided to instruct his carpenters George Muller, John Ollivant, and John Fairfowl at Albany, quote, to build a boat to draw as little water as a canoe and cart more goods so that our men may learn to manage them, for there's no end to building canoes. In one trip they are spoiled or broke, so they are not fit to go a second by the unskillfulness of our men. The flat-bottomed barge was completed and launched the following spring. The vessel transported goods upriver to Henley House, returning 16 days later without incident. A second, more substantial boat was then built, measuring 23 feet by 6 foot 4 inches broad. However, when used further upriver, particularly in the fall when the river levels were lower, these boats proved too heavy and deep and canoes had to be used. Despite these seasonal problems, boats continued to be built and used to transport freight between Albany and Henley House, with birch crooks and keels sent to Albany in 1775 to build new boats. And a kiln was constructed for steaming planks. The latter suggests a shape boat requiring bent planks was by then being built, possibly with pointed ends rather than a swim-ended barge. Next. The York factory had started as a trading post in 1680 and became the main transshipment post for the bay, where the supply ships that arrived annually from England made their landfall. Bay sloops then sailed between the Hudson Bay Company posts around the bay, collecting packages of beaver pelts and other small animal furs, and distributing supplies, including trading goods from England for the natives. A plan of York Fort drawn about 1750 shows a fleet of native canoes arriving at the fort jetty and 2 large boats with the red-painted top strakes moored off. Haystacks are visible in the field adjacent and several cannon guarding the river approaches. Dennis Johnson's researches indicates that boats were not generally being used upriver from York Fort at this time, so these may be coast boats. Next. In 1779, a French-Canadian fur trader suggested using lightweight bateaux to carry goods. A smaller version of the bateau was shipped from England and together with locally built bateaux, were used successfully to extend the company's operations 1,200 miles inland along rivers from the bay. The 5-man bateau was 26 feet long by 6 foot 6 inches wide and could carry 1.3 tons, about the same as the canoe, but required fewer crew and was not so susceptible to damage. In 1811, the Earl of Selkirk, who had invested in the Hudson Bay Company, brought a number of Highlanders over to settle south of Winnipeg. This became known as the Red River Settlement. Next. The ship arrived at York Fort late in the season, and our master decided to depart before they had unloaded all of the cargo to avoid being trapped in the bay by winter ice. This included many of the boats which were needed to transport the settlers up the Hayes River and along the length of Lake Winnipeg to the Red River, a distance of some 700 miles. As a result, new boats had to be built at York that winter under the direction of Miles MacDonald, who insisted they be built without keels, as he had seen on the St. Lawrence River. However, the handling of these boats in the fast-flowing rapids and when hauled ashore at several portages proved keels were essential to aid direction afloat and stiffen the boats when dragged over timber rollers. Next. The settlers had abandoned 2 of the newly built boats in favour of company boats with keels before reaching Lake Winnipeg, and the only new boat to make it to their destination had by then acquired an external keel nailed to the bottom. Next. Company boats continued to be used to travel to the Red River settlement and other inland posts. The surviving details of the type of boats used are sketchy. Next. When the wind was from astern and the river sufficiently wide and clear of obstructions, a square sail was set to propel the boats, with oars being used otherwise. Poles and ropes hauled from the shore were often used when tracking upstream against a strong current. Next. This illustration, besides showing 2 double-ended boats in the foreground, also shows a small coast boat being built under cover and what may be a sawhorse or trestle for supporting timber while being worked. George Simpson was appointed governor of the Northern Department after the Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Companies merged in 1821, and he actively encouraged the use of boats rather than canoes to carry freight where possible. Next. Brigades of York boats, consisting of 7 or 8 vessels, were organised to operate between storage depots from as far west as Rocky Mountain House, with some 200 boats and 1,200 men involved over the entire network. Next. If hauling a York boat weighing 1.3 tons across a portage was difficult, unloading and transporting the cargo also involved huge physical effort by the boat's crew. 2 or more bales, each weighing about 90 pounds, were loaded on tripmen's backs, who then set off to cover the mile-long Robinson Portage. Men often suffered crippling injuries to their bodies, and boats had to be replaced after only 3 or 4 seasons of use. So what did a York boat look like? In 1997, Dennis Johnson measured the last surviving York boat at Lower Fort Garry and produced a set of drawings. Next. The boat dated from about 1920 and had a length of nearly 44 feet and a breadth of 10 foot 6 and was pointed at both ends, shaped with a flat bottom, round bilges and flared sides. The boat was Carnival planked, smooth skinned, except for 2 clinker or lap strakes wrapped around the sheer each side, and was constructed with a keel and raked stems and framed with steam bent timbers and sawn floors fitted alternately. The keel was grooved each side to receive the edge of the garboard strake. Iron bolts and nails secured the keel to the floor timbers and frames, and the planking was nailed to the frames with the end of the nail hooked and turned back into the timber. The lapped plank edges were skewered using copper nails riveted over roofs inside. Next. Once the hull structure was complete, the carvel plank seams were caulked by wedging oakum from outside, as shown in the middle slide, coated with boiled tar, and the boat was then launched and filled with water for several days so the planking could soak and swell and achieve a tight hull. The timber used to build the York boats came from native trees, which had to be felled and transported by boat to the forts for conversion. Natural crooks were sourced from sawn frames before steam bent timbers were used. Spruce was the main type of timber used, though tamarack, a type of larch, was sometimes sourced for the keel and framing. Two structural features of interest include A, the gripe block or deadwood used to connect the keel to the stems, and B, the mix of carvel and clinker planking for the hull. Next. On the York boat, the gripe block essentially forms a short extension to both ends of the keel and is arranged with short overlapping joints onto both stem and keel, which are secured with clench bolts. Next. The now largely obsolete member, at least on small boats, may have been a continuation of a structural feature used by English shipwrights when constructing the stems and sloops built at the bay in the 18th century. Next. By comparison, the stem and keel joint on the Orkney yawl is formed with a half-lap joint directly between the two members, which is reinforced internally with a knee or deadwood. Next. The use of carvel planking for the hull, except for the top two strakes, which were clinker, is a feature sometimes seen on whaleboats, but also on troop carriers first used by the British in 1758 to land soldiers on beaches in wars against the French and later the Americans. Next. A contemporary model of a round-bowed flatboat in the Maritime Museum at Greenwich is carvel built with 3 clinker strakes each side. And the same boats are shown here in action in 1776 in a painting by Robert Cleveley. The bateau from Albany in 1796 also had 3 clinker top strakes, and boats built at York Factory in 1813 displayed the same mix of clinker and carvel planking, a method which was clearly unfamiliar to a newly hired boatbuilder from Stromness, who had, quote, never rout of such kind carvel built in his life before. A carvel built hull was less vulnerable to damage from rocks than the exposed edges of clinker planking, and perhaps more importantly, was easier to patch and repair if planks were broken or punctured on passage. Also, carvel planking was only secured to the frames, so fewer fastenings were needed than with clinker planking, where the seam laps required closely spaced clenches. Nails on roofs were very time-consuming to make. Next. The York boat was propelled with 8 round-loomed oars worked between thole pins slotted into the gunwale. A steering oar or blade was worked through a ring on the starboard side of the stern post and used when not under sail. When sailing, a mast with square sail was stepped amidships, and a rudder with deep blade was hinged on the stern post. Next. The later York boats were bigger and could carry more than 5 tons of cargo, with a crew of only 9 men, whereas the Nars Canoe needed 7 paddlers to transport 1.2 tons. Next. Boat builders at the various posts were kept busy building as many as 60 York boats each year, and boats continued to be used to carry freight until about 1925. By this time, other transport links had opened up, and wheeled carts, paddle steamers, and the railway competed for business over the Hudson Bay Company network. Many of the boat builders employed by the Hudson Bay Company hailed from Orkney. A list of 7 Orkney boat builders serving at 2 forts in 1798 is shown in this next slide. Next. Sorry, can you go back then? The top person, Nicholas Tate, is later listed in the 1821 census as a merchant in Stromness and appears to have purchased land and built a house above the shore in Dundas Street sometime before 1825. James Sinclair, the second person, also returned to Stromness, where he continued to work as a boat builder. Next. By 1812, there were 14 boat builders from the west mainland of Orkney working at 6 of the Hudson's Bay Company forts. Later boat builders included John Rich from Gramsay, who served the Hudson's Bay Company for 15 years, building many boats, including 3 for Dease and Simpson's Arctic expedition in 1837. The latter included 2 clinker-built boats, 24 feet long, and 8 6-foot beam, propelled by oars and 2 lug sails. In the summer of 2001, a replica York boat was sailed and rowed from Red River to York Factory by 7 men and a woman. Next. The journey was filmed and took 2 months to complete. The boat survived a heavy collision with a submerged rock, being hauled across the Robinson Portage and passing through 2-meter-high standing waves. The crew came away with enormous respect for the toughness and resilience of the men of the York Main Line, who made the York boat such a great success. And that concludes this presentation.
Well, thank you both, Len and Dennis, for such an amazing talk. And I just love that old illustrations. We've got loads of questions here. The first one, I'm not sure who wants to answer, but did the Hudson Bay Company operate on the Arctic coast? And if so, what kind of craft did they use there?
Well, yes, they did, all along right through the Northwest Passage. And they used a variety of boats, but notably schooners. They had an auxiliary schooner, the Aklavik, which on one occasion, I think it was in 1937, the year before I was born, the Aklavik set off from the west to proceed through the passage. And they had a steamer, an ice-breaking steamer that had been built in Newcastle, the Nascopy. She set out from Montreal, and they met in the middle of the Northwest Passage and transferred furs. So that was, I think, it was claimed to be the first commercial transition of the passage. So they had done it before, but they hadn't been, it wasn't a trading enterprise. And interestingly, they weren't interested in making a name for themselves. They were interested in making money, so they didn't make a big thing about it. But the skipper of the Aklavik, a man, Scotty Gall, I think Scotty Gall, he said about it, he says, we could have done that anytime, he says, but it wasn't our business. We went for the furs were. So yeah, they did work all across the Arctic.
That's amazing. Yeah, and also Simpson in his fast boats. Is it true that he once travelled around the world by land?
He did. I'm not sure what year it was, about the 1840s, I think, sometime there. And it was he was in London, and he set out from London, sailed to Canada, crossed Canada, Birch Bark canoe and horseback, and to get to the west coast. From there, he took a side trip and he went out to Hawaii and back, and then proceeded to cross up into northern. I think he got a ship to take him across to the west to eastern Russia. Landed there, and he crossed Siberia and Russia to St. Petersburg by same way, by boat and by horse, and maybe hired coach and horses, something like that. But he went all the way across and back to London. It didn't stop there. He jumped on a boat again back to Canada, and I think it took him about a year and a half. But I did read somewhere that they thought that had been the inspiration for Round the World in 80 Days, but it took him a year and a half.
Quite the traveller then, yeah. We don't have time for all the questions, so any questions we don't have, we'll make sure that the two of you get them, and we'll try and get them posted up on our website. Here's one for Dennis. Why did the York boats use two types of planks or planking?
Well, the use of Carnival Planking in the bottom, I think I tried to explain that was probably to minimize damage and to make it easier to repair when you were on passage. The two clinker planks, it seems to be a feature that was left on or was common, well, was visible on boats that were built around that time, some boats. The lap obviously gives you a stiffer structure than does the carvel between the frames. But really, other than that, I don't think there's an explanation.
Maybe to make them more versatile, what you're saying. Len, a question about the Birch Bark canoes. Would you ever try to make one yourself? And
I don't think so. Well, the thing about the birch bark, actually, it can be peeled off and it doesn't disintegrate or split. And I think it's the only tree that is like that. So it's and I'm sure it says 3,000 years old, but I'm sure they were making other things before they started making canoes.
Yeah. And somebody asked them, I think it's Bill, says, how did they get them back up the river?
Well, paddle where you can, but where there's rapids or fast flowing, there was portage. Had to carry them. Same with the York boats.
Yeah.
The York boats had some very long portages, and there was one crossing over to go north to the Mackenzie River. I think it's about 12 miles long. So they didn't take the boat; they had a boat at each end. But they had to carry all that cargo, 6 tons of cargo, from 6 tons, 12 tons, 6 tons for each end. You imagine?
That's amazing.
12 miles, tough.
Yeah, incredible. Got time for one more question. This is from Richard, and he says, how many people were employed by the Hudson Bay Company, and do you know what the annual turnover might have been at its peak?
I think the numbers were not terribly high, actually. Was there not something about 380 people, Len?
I think it was in the region of maybe just over 400 Orkney men.
Was it?
So, and that was 80%, so you can work it out. But that's at one particular time. I mean, the company grew into something else, and they started taking interest in other kinds of business than fur trade. So I can't tell you what the peak would have been.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you both again, and to everyone for their participation, and thank you also to the technical team for all your behind-the-scenes work. We still have spaces for the PD Kirk lunches and the evening Festival Club table sessions. Please find links under each lunch description on our website. And we'd also like to invite you all to the Festival Club tonight, and hopefully the link will be in the live chat, so please come along. And if you're enjoying the festival, please like our Facebook page and follow the YouTube channel. And next we have 2 films. A Pollutant's Tale with Tim Harrison and Professor Dudley Shallgross at 5:15, and then another at the 5:15 is the second one. That one's called Otters and Orcas, Puffins and Skuas by the amazingly talented Raymond Besant. The first film is on at the back 3, and our next talk is at 9 o'clock, and it's called The News from the Heart of the World by Alan Herrera and Professor Alex Rogers. And after all that, thank you all and good evening. got her help in the end, wasn't there?